This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston, in the United States of America. Today, we are honored that our thoughtful, bold leader joins us from Harvard Business School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the USA. She is the John and Natty MacArthur University Professor at Harvard University. At Harvard Business School, she teaches the award-winning course, Reimagining Capitalism, and is co-chair of the Business and Environment Initiative. She is a research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the best-selling author of the widely acclaimed book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, and her work is frequently published in academic journals. In 2018, she was elected to the British and American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She advises some of the world's leading corporations and serves on the boards of Amgen and IDEX Laboratories. In 2019, Financial Times awarded her Outstanding Director Award. In her teens, she fell in love with a copper beech tree and our natural environment. Growing up in an English manor house in the West Midlands in England, she is obsessed with change and the urgency for change. Stay with us as she shares more about our misguided worldview of capitalism, her theory of change, reimagining capitalism, and why business can do well and do good, why global heating is an unprecedented challenge, and why Mandela's leadership paradigm is an extraordinary opportunity to help protect our planet and save our world. We warmly welcome the outstanding professor, my professor from Harvard Business School, a woman I admire and applaud, Professor Rebecca Henderson, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Rebecca, it's such a joy to see you again. Thank you so much for bringing your wisdom, your knowledge, your passion to this wonderful Mandela message and movement for change.
And it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you very, very much for inviting me.
That's great. I thought a wonderful place to begin. You know, your book, Reimagining Capitalism, was such a joy to read. And after being in your wonderful classes at Harvard Business School on Reimagining Capitalism, what struck me in the book was just how you began, and that you grew up British, and that there were two kind of lasting imprints on your life. One, your love of nature and having an experience of something larger than yourself. And the second, your professional curiosity, and I think you called it obsession around change. So, you know, having had that childhood influence, I guess my question is, was there a particular defining moment growing up that really had a pivotal impact on you, your life, and what you care about in the world today?
And sometimes I think there's something wrong with me because I don't have many defining moments that I can point to. Change in my life has been much more gradual, much more organic. So I can point to a defining memory.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure it's like the moment I woke up. So, or, decided what to do with the rest of my life. And as you suggest, there are really two defining memories for me. One is lying on the branch of a great copper beech tree in Shropshire, with sunlight filtering down to me through the leaves and the smell of cut grass, and just a feeling of peace and connection. And what I think about now is a feeling of deep time. It was a very old tree. I would guess 300 or 400 years old. At least it had been standing there. And that sense, not of being erased, but of being part of something much larger and much deeper, something very beautiful and very kind. And that's been a central experience and continues to be a central experience for me. The second sort of memory, and again, this is a composite, I think, rather than a particular moment, is realizing that one of the largest and most successful pottery in England, so this is a firm that made tableware, dishes, plates, serving vessels. One of the largest pottery in England had a workflow, that is, they were processing their work, literally like moving it through the factory, in a layout that I suspected was at least 50 years old and might be 100 years old. What are they doing? I was a very junior analyst working for a major consulting company, and I had just mapped the journey of a plate through the factory. Went up 2 stories and went down 2 stories and turned left. And then, it was crazy. I mean, I wasn't very experienced. This was the early 80s, but I knew enough about modern manufacturing to know 2 things. One, this is a problem. And 2, it shouldn't be me, a junior analyst, who's like, seeing this. What is happening? And that sort of experience got me very, very interested in the problem of change, or let's call it the phenomenon of change, because change is not a problem, it just is change. Why is it that, and initially I was studying this in large business organizations, and that's where I spent the first half of my career. Why is it that large firms have so much trouble seeing that the world is changing, doing new things, moving in new directions? And that got me going in all kinds of other directions that I'm sure we'll talk about, including why do individuals have so much trouble? Why do states have so much trouble? Why is the planet having so much trouble? But in general, change, that's what really resonates for me.
That's so interesting. And we will talk about that in more detail. I was also struck by the fact that your brother, a freelance environmental journalist, seemed to be some catalyst of change for you in some way, in terms of encouraging or inspiring you to read the science behind climate change. Can you share a little more around how his work shifted you?
Sure. So I became a professor, a management professor, and I started studying change in large organizations. I was the Kodak Professor of Management, which was deeply ironic. And I was having a great career. It was a good time. I was really enjoying my work. And then my brother started sending me some of the early scientific work on climate change. Not that early. I mean, we're talking 1990s, early 1990s. And I read the papers, and my first thought was, oh dear, I need to quit. Here I am in a business school, oiling the wheels of corporate capitalism, and I should leave. I should dedicate my life to doing something about this problem. We say climate change, it's really global heating. We're systematically heating up the entire planet. And even in those early papers, you could see what was going to happen unless we took appropriate action. And that really reoriented my professional career in a very fundamental way.
Yes.
I thought of quitting. It was my friends who worked for nonprofit organizations in environmental action who persuaded me not to.
Yeah.
They said, you can do more if you stay where you are. I still wonder if that was right, but I took it very much to heart.
Yeah.
And I think there's a broader point there, which is global heating is so ubiquitous and is going to change so much that all of us can do something. It doesn't matter what your gift is, where you're working. We have to change pretty much everything. So everyone can help.
Yeah. And to that point, Rebecca, what strikes me, I mean, I think you are in the perfect place. I mean, teaching the program you teach at Harvard on reimagining capitalism, and also the fantastic, widely acclaimed book you've written around, the role of business and how business can help save the world. Can you share with us what motivated you to write the book, and which was published in 2020, the first edition, and why now?
I wrote the book because my students asked me to. I had about 10 years before started a new course at the Harvard Business School on capitalism, because when many people think about global heating, their first thought is, well, this is capitalism's fault. I talk to audiences of young people and they say, why reimagine capitalism? Why not just throw it out the window? Which is a great question we can come back to. But my initial thought, and it remains my thought, is no, that would be a major mistake. We have to find a way to reconcile the power and flexibility and scale and reach of capitalism with living on a sustainable planet, living on a thriving planet. And let me say, I focus a lot on global heating because I think it's so critical, but all these issues are tied to each other: inequality, equity, global justice. We need to find a way to reconcile a thriving economy with a survivable planet, with a thriving planet, and a world in which everyone has enough to eat and basic security and jobs with dignity and respect. And we're now talking, wow, when I started all this, it's nearly 20 years ago. It's about 20 years ago. I had no idea how to do that. I didn't even know if it was possible. I had an intuition it was important. I'm one of the people who thinks that the huge economic progress we've seen over the last 50 years is valuable. It hasn't been as well distributed as we would like, but we now, particularly those of us in the developed West, live lives that others could only dream of. But we've seen billions of people come out of poverty. We've seen huge increases in life expectancy across the entire world. The number of children who die before their 4th birthday has fallen precipitously since 1840, not just as a percentage of the population, but total. So, I'm a fan of capitalism. I'm a fan of its drive and its energy, but how do we reconcile it? Because, to take the position of those young people who say, well, let's just get rid of this. Let's see. A capitalist is someone who cares about nothing but making money. And in principle often is constrained by their investors to focus on only that, to maximize shareholder value, to maximize the bottom line of the corporation. And that can imply pushing onto everyone else those inconvenient costs, like the costs that are generated when you burn fossil fuel or when you drive wages down, pushing all those other costs onto society. And so really, capitalism, is that what we want, So that was the origin of the course. When I first started, there were 28 people in the room, which for the Harvard Business School is tiny. I was used to teaching classes of, more than 90 people.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing semester. And the next year, 365 students signed up to take the course.
Wow. Wow.
And that was amazing. And it became the fastest growing elective at the business school in the last 15, 20 years, or one of them. I have to be careful, but certainly one of the fastest growing electives.
Yes.
Yeah. And many of the students came to me and said, Rebecca, you have to write this down, because I'm trying to explain to my friends what you're talking about. And, I can't really do the whole thing. And so please write down what it is you're teaching. And so I tried to write a book that is written for people in business.
Yes.
That is a roadmap to building a capitalism that is just, that is regenerative, that is a partner with civil society and government in building a world in which we can all thrive.
Yes.
And, lots of people are working this field. My book's just one of many, but it's a pleasure to be part of what's becoming increasingly a worldwide movement to rethink how we run firms, what their goals should be, how they should be governed, what we should ask of them. And that's been really exciting. I still get emails. The book's been out about 4 years now, and I still get emails almost every day from people who have written it, have read it or enjoyed it and want to know more, and tell me it's made a difference to them in their careers, which is amazing.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic book, and I have read it a couple of times, and I think it's got a wonderful balance between the research, the theory, but very practical examples with a very practical roadmap, as you say, for corporations to follow. And I think what also struck me in your analysis in the book, when you talk about a reimagined capitalism, can you share a little more about what it requires? What is your thinking around redefining the purpose of the firm and also redefining their role in society? Can you share a little more about that?
Sure. So many managers and many investors assume that the purpose of the firm is to make as much money as possible. But that's not actually correct from a historical perspective, a philosophical perspective, or a legal perspective.
Yeah.
So let's take those in order. Historically, firms were created, and they are creations of government, of the state. Firms were created to benefit society. So here in the US, the earliest corporations were formed to do things like build bridges and make roads. They were a way to bring capital together, to mobilize capital in the service of society, to produce goods and services that people want and need.
Yeah.
And profit then becomes a means to an end. Profit is necessary in order to persuade people to invest in these firms. But, if you'd asked those early legislators, well, is the goal just to make as much money as possible and take over the world? They would have said, no. The goal is to get the bridges built. The goal is to get the roads built.
Yeah.
And if we go forward philosophically, what I find very interesting, and many people don't know, is when Milton Friedman, who is a famous economist and really famous for saying the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder value, when you go back and read his work and look underneath the hood, he was saying the purpose of the firm is to maximize social welfare. And the best way to do that is to maximize profits.
Yeah.
Which is a very different statement, right? Because when you go back and you look at those, we now call them neoclassical or neoliberal economists, and neoliberals become a term of abuse. But when you look at what they were, the place they were starting is free markets, perfectly competitive markets where prices reflect full costs, everyone has full information and everyone can compete. They're amazing. They generate political freedom, they generate economic freedom. They're fabulous. And in a free market, which has all those characteristics, which I want to come back to, maximizing profit will maximize social welfare. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So we have both the historical and the philosophical. We build firms to maximize social welfare. So the interesting question now is, does maximizing profits maximize the public good? Well, it might in some ideal world where there was perfect regulation and government that regulated the firms so that it didn't, for example, dump trillions of tons of greenhouse gases into the environment for free. It didn't do everything it could, and I'm caricaturing, but there are firms of whom this is true, everything they could to undermine labor organization, labor well-being, worker well-being. It's just cheap, 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 cheap. And pump money into the democratic process to ensure that they're not properly regulated. Under those conditions, does maximizing profit maximize human well-being? Well, definitely not. I mean, really not. Some firms, and I'll pick extreme examples, but a cement firm or a steel firm, for example, the emissions they generate cause more damage to human health right now and to climate, global heating in the long term than their entire revenues. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy, crazy. Now, we're using the cement and the steel. I'm not saying those are evil companies. I'm saying that something is off. You know, when I power my cell phone, I can spend $10 on the electricity. That will typically generate about $8 worth of harm to human health and $8 worth of long-term global heating. So that $10 of electricity comes with $16 of damage. It's a problem. So profit being the only goal is a huge problem. Now, having said that, what do we do about it? Because profit is necessary, right? I have more than 20 years experience on corporate boards, and, turning around to your investors and saying, well, we're not going to generate a profit anymore is like not a viable option. So the question then is, okay, so suppose I'm a manager, I'm a CEO of a firm, and I go, okay, we have a problem. What can I do? And in the book, I try and answer that question. And I lay out 5 clear steps. I'd be happy to go through them. And I try and have lots of examples. And just for fun, can I tell you about the examples? So I had the first draft of the book, and I gave it to my best friend from high school, who's super smart, interesting woman. And she read the book and she said, Rebecca, nice ideas. This is really boring. Your competition is Netflix. Netflix reruns. You have to go back and you have to make this book come alive. And so I really tried. I mean, I'm at the Harvard Business School. I'd done all these great cases. I knew business people. And I tried to bring those living, breathing possibilities in the room. And indeed, in teaching Reimagining Capitalism, what I found is the students didn't really believe what I was saying. I could lay out my 5-point framework till the cows came home. And they go, well, that's very interesting, Professor Henderson. It's when you bring in the people who are doing it and you show them that it is possible to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation and make a big difference in the lives of the people who work for you and cut your emissions by 30% and make money the whole way down. That's when people start to believe you. It's when you bring in a small entrepreneur, like, my favorite guy, I talk about so much because I like him so much, Erik Osmundson, who founded a company called Norsk Gjenvinning, which revolutionized the waste collection business in Norway. I mean, it's a tiny business, right? Tiny business. No, hardly any margin. You want to do it, you can do it. And I think the estimates, my best guess, no one really knows, is we could reduce emission of global greenhouse gases by about 40 to 50% and make money the whole way. Wow. And I mean, it take a lot of work and energy and focus, but it's completely possible. And so profit should not be the goal of the firm. It never was. The goal of the firm is helping to build a thriving and prosperous society. Profit is a means to an end, not an end in itself.
Yes, yes.
And that's the thing to keep a hold of. Everything else is detail.
Yes.
But that's the fundamental shift.
You know, you also in your book quoted Ray Dalio, who founded one of the world's largest hedge funds. And I was curious about his view. I mean, he's a money man. And to what extent, I mean, perhaps you'd like to expand a little more on his thought around capitalism today and where capitalism needs to be, but also as a money person, what have you learned from Ray in terms of his thinking around how do you change the big money people to rewire finance and capitalism?
So I quote Ray because he's very famous and very, very rich.
Yes.
But I have never met him, or maybe like briefly at a cocktail party. The person who really changed my thinking about what the financial system could do was a man called Hiro Mizuno, who was the chief investment officer of the Japanese pension fund.
Okay.
The Japanese pension fund is one of the largest pools of money in the world. It controls more than 1% of, I think, all financially traded assets, certainly 1% of globally traded equities. It's enormous. It is, for example, Larry Fink's, he runs BlackRock, the asset manager. It is Larry Fink's largest customer. So Hiro Mizuno was Larry Fink's largest customer for a long time. And Hiro became the chief investment officer of this huge pool of capital and started thinking about what his duty was. What was his duty? His duty was to Japanese pensioners of the future. And he came to believe that global heating was one of the largest dangers to the long-term welfare of his pensioners, of the people to whom he was legally responsible.
Yeah.
And he said, well, you know, I could maximize the value of this portfolio in individual stocks, and there might be two problems. The first problem might be that none of my pensioners can go outside anymore because air quality is so bad, and we're looking at fires everywhere. And Japan is very vulnerable to global heating. And secondly, although I might think I was maximizing value, well, wait a moment. If we see some of the worst possible effects from this, the whole economy might collapse. And that wouldn't be good for the finances either. Yeah. And global heating is what we call technically a non-diversifiable risk. That is, you know, one of the supposed miracles, and it is a bit of a miracle of modern finance, is instead of all the risk being concentrated, so I live in my house, if the house burns down, I lose basically all the wealth I have. I can instead take out an insurance policy, and that policy can then be spread across the entire world. So everybody's carrying a tiny, tiny bit of the risk that my house might burn down.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's what financial markets do. But the trouble is, when the world starts heating up, everybody's house burns down. Yeah. You really can't diversify the risk. And the concrete example of this is now in Florida and California, you can't buy housing insurance from a private insurance company. The companies have withdrawn from those markets because the risks are too large and they can't be diversified. It's so big, and everyone knows that risk is so large, you can't diversify it. So now the states are carrying the risk, which means the federal government is carrying the risk, which means, whoa, and I won't go down here, but we're looking at a potential large-scale major shift in the worldwide insurance markets. Anyway, so back to Hiro Mizuno. Hiro said, you know, I could try and get 1% more on every stock, but because I'm so big, I own every stock. what will make me rich and my pensioners, meet my responsibility to my pensioners, is taking care of the whole system.
Yeah.
And so if we think of finance as having an interest in taking care of the whole system, that's a really interesting and exciting idea.
Yeah.
Now, it's a little scary too. There's a room somewhere where 15 people who control, opinions differ, but maybe 50% of the world's financial resources get together. I'm scared that room exists. That's way too much power to be in the hands of 15 people. But one of the things they could do, is decide, global heating, we should do something about that. And I mean, if we'd moved 20 years ago, it would have been 3% of GDP. It would have been pretty gradual. We could have done it no problem. We could now be talking to each other saying, whoa, well, that was a bullet we dodged, and look how much cleaner the air is now. The number of people dying from respiratory diseases has plummeted, and oh my goodness, thank goodness we have a world to give to our children.
Yeah.
We didn't do that. So now it's a bit more expensive, but it's still so much more effective to move now at scale than to wait and wait and wait. And maybe the financial markets will see that. Now, in the short term, parts of the financial market have woken up to the fact that focusing only on profit is not always a good way to make profit.
Yeah.
And that other things may matter. So a lot of the big family money in Europe, for example, is starting to say, we don't only care about making absolutely as much money as possible. We want a decent return, and we want our money to be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Sure.
So there is money, there is finance moving in the direction of a more sustainable world. We're seeing, big money flowing into so-called sustainably managed firms, into investment funds with these kinds of titles. We see more and more firms committing to be net zero. Sometimes they do it because they can see there's a profitable way to do it. There is greenwashing. We need to change the accounting system. We could talk more about that too. But money can make a huge difference, and I think is beginning to do that.
That's fantastic. And you alluded to the fact that if we'd woken up, 10, 20 years ago, it would have been much more cost effective. You also mentioned about, this obsession with change. Based on your career and your experience in your career, plus the research you've done, why do you think denial is so pervasive and change is so hard? What have you uncovered personally and from a research point of view?
Oh, and I'm laughing for two reasons. One is I spent my entire career on this, and you want me to give you an answer in 3 minutes, which is fine, and I will. But also because one of the books I'm currently asking the students I work with to read is by a man called George Marshall, and it's called Don't Even Think About It. And it's 43 reasons why addressing climate change is so hard. And here's the bad news. George's book is great, but he only covers a small fraction of the reasons climate change is so hard to move on. But let me try and summarize what's happening. Okay. And I'm not the first person to say this, but climate change, global heating is a wicked problem. It's really hard. Why? Well, first, for a long time, we couldn't see it or feel it. Secondly, the effects are likely to be in the future. And for a long time, we were saying, well, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now. And so let's just take that combination. You can't see it or feel it, and the effects are a long time in the future. Well, that's rather like your doctor saying to you, perhaps, when you're 20, you really shouldn't eat hamburgers and you should really exercise. Because if you don't do that, you're going to have a heart attack. And we know how many young people say, unfortunately, I don't see it, I don't feel it, and 20 years is an infinite length of time. So just as humans, we as individuals are not good at very long-term problems, which we can't immediately see or feel, unless we have a cultural structure for holding them. So when families have small children, they start thinking about the future like you wouldn't believe. They buy insurance, they invest in their kids like crazy. What's happening? Well, you've got a cultural structure that says, got to do the best thing for them, got to, take them where they need to be. And then that's reinforced by an emotional issue that kicks in, which is got to do the right thing by my kids. Not all families do, but in functioning societies, we have to do the right thing by the kids. And alas, the US is not a great example of this, but in many societies, people say, how do you build a great society? You treat children like kings and you put them in palaces. We invest in schooling, we invest in strong maternal care. So humans can do it, but you have to kind of decide to do it. So that's the first big problem with climate. It's invisible and it's a long way away.
Yeah.
Third big problem. There's lots of people making money from the status quo.
Yeah.
And they have a very strong incentive to think and to act and to say, well, but fossil fuels, the main driver of greenhouse gases, they're the lifeblood of our civilization. Do you want to go back to the Stone Age? We have to keep burning these. Do you want to keep people poor? Energy is what drives material progress. And besides, climate change is just a theory. And so we had a very significant fraction of the economy. The energy sector is a huge sector of the economy, has been for a very long time. And for many years, governments subsidized it because it was a driver of growth. Cheap energy is one of the things, perhaps the most important thing that took us out of poverty. A car is what? 100 horsepower. We don't think about it, but that's 100 horses sitting in your driveway waiting for you, and you don't have to feed them or grow them, or it's fossil fuels are amazing. So we have this very powerful force saying no, 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 no. And we know now that Exxon in 1982 had forecasts that showed really clearly what was going to happen. And in their own documents, they say this has potentially catastrophic consequences. And what does Exxon do? They spend an enormous amount of money and time and energy denying it's a problem and corrupting the political process to say, it's not a problem. And then the last reason, and I will stop. I have two more.
Yes.
One is, I say, well, it's much cheaper to act now than to wait and bear the costs of what's going to happen. But if you're a politician or a CEO, it's hard to invest in the future.
Yeah.
Because we can say, and if you ask people worldwide, a majority will say we need action on global heating now. But then you say to them, well, does that mean I can spend less on your school or cut your wages? And it's hard, right? There are hard trade-offs, and we haven't yet developed the social consensus that that trade-off is worth making. Yeah. So very few people would say we shouldn't build schools or pay teachers because it does nothing for me right now. But we're doing the equivalent of that in global heating, partly because we've never had a problem like this before. The nearest equivalent is a major war. But in war, we are emotionally mobilized to fight others, and we can see it's a threat. Yeah. And we don't have that feeling around global heating yet. And that gets me to my last reason, which is that in this country, at least, but increasingly more broadly, work on climate change is getting tied up in the political wars. And those sectors of the society that feel they're losing out to the modern world, to modernity, often rural, often of a dominant ethnicity. In the US, they tend to be white and rural, feel deeply threatened by changes in the world, deeply threatened by people who don't look like them, who don't feel like them. and they're turning to authoritarian strongmen, and so far they're all strongmen, who say, we can put the world back the way it was.
Yeah.
That's what Make America Great Again is. We can put the world back the way it was. When driving a car proudly was a sign of manhood, and, you know, America ruled the world. It's so attractive, right? Because the modern world is a difficult place. And one of the things that's happened is the sort of ruling elite who for years were hiding behind, well, we're maximizing profits, we're maximizing profits. And lots of ordinary people were not seeing the benefits of that, were seeing themselves overlooked and often disregarded, saying, well, what have you done for me? And now you come along and you tell me that climate change is a big deal. Oh, yeah? Well, it might be a big deal for you, but I have other problems.
Yeah.
And that's really feeding into the political dynamics in very, very negative ways. So we have individual psychological reasons, and George Marshall's wonderful book, he goes through 44 individual psychological biases and others, like how the media is structured, how we consume news, how tempting it is to fall into denial or apathy or despair. I mean, this is always the part in my presentation. I haven't even shown you the heat maps, right? Where we talk about the fact that we're almost certainly going to go to 2 degrees, and much of India and Southeast Asia and equatorial Africa and South America will become uninhabitable, and hundreds of millions of refugees migrating north. I mean, we have a problem.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing, actually. I mean, I think I read in one of your articles that they estimate about 1 billion refugees by 2050.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's trying to
I can't remember if it's exactly that number, but the numbers are absolutely horrendous. It's because the equatorial belt will heat up, and it will be impossible to work outside during the day. It's just, and you know, one of the things I find hardest now is all this is happening, and yet so many privileged people in the developing world are not yet mobilized or seem to care or want to do anything. And my friends who are, you know, have had much tougher lives than I have and worked in much less privileged places, they look at me and they say, Rebecca, you know, there's 1,000 global heatings going on all the time. And, you know, you didn't care about those before, you know, using the general you. And, you know, our human ability to turn away from suffering and ignore it. And then I think of all the heroes and leaders. I mean, I feel myself wanting to talk about Mandela, if it's okay.
Yes, please do. I mean, I'd love
because
to how Mandela...
You know, I've become really, really interested in this question of how do you face an impossible problem that's far too big for any single individual to make a difference on? And realistically, is probably unsolvable, in the sense that if you were an alien coming down from outer space, I mean, hello, alien, do you think humans are going to solve this problem? I think the alien will go, probably not. Sorry about that. There'll be other planets. You know, and it's not that the Earth is going to die, but human society, if we don't start moving more quickly, will be fundamentally disrupted. There'll be massive suffering. So how do you look at all that realistically and not turn away, not numb yourself out, not say someone else, I'll wait for someone else? How do you do that? And so I've become super interested in people who have done that. So I read a lot about what happened in South Africa when I was working on my book. I was looking for moments in history where the private sector really stepped up and was part of the change. And as you might remember, in my book, I talk about Denmark and Mauritius and Germany as examples. Denmark in the 19th, Germany in the 20th, and Mauritius in the 60s, as examples when the private sector really stepped up. But, I read a ton about what happened in South Africa. And you can't do that, Anne. I'm telling this to you. You can't do that without coming away with incredible admiration for Mr. Mandela.
Yes.
I mean, the general betting was that South Africa would be a bloodbath.
Absolutely.
That, the dominant white portion of society, no way were they going to give up their privileges. And it was deeply embedded ideologically. People had been raised that way. And, there were guns. And we know, that there's no givens in this world.
And just to that point, I remember as a child being in supermarkets where people had carts just filled with tin food, building bunkers. I mean, I remember that as a child.
Oh, yeah.
Very,
this was not an abstract idea. And so, a hugely difficult problem with, and how many 100 years of history behind it? 300, 200?
Well, 1652 is when the first
right.
Yeah.
With more than 300 years of this is the way the world is supposed to be behind it. And then so it's an impossible problem. And then Mandela is in jail for a very, very long time, right? So, and I know people who are sitting comfortably behind desks running corporations. Well, there's nothing I can do. Well, you try being in jail and trying to transform an entire society. I'm thinking about how you're going to do that. And I feel a little embarrassed because the story's been told so many times, but being able to look at what's really going on. Because I think if you're going to support change, be part of change, you have to really understand what's going on.
Yes.
You have to look at it with open eyes. And clearly he did that. He all his early work, he knew what was happening in that society. He really understood at a deep level. And then, I can't remember reading about this, but given all the other experiences I've had, I bet he had moments when he was just in deep despair.
Oh,
like,
I through very dark moments.
How could you not? In some ways, it's a rational response. And then I think what I'm learning, and I'm just learning and how to deal with this and how to think about it for myself. I think you have to face grief, like for all that's happening and for all the suffering. And, just live through that and open your mind to that suffering. Because if you get stuck in despair and you don't grieve, then you get stuck. You just get stuck. So, and then you have space for hope. And I love Rebecca Solnit's phrase about hope. Hope is not this nice thing that tells you everything is going to be all right. Hope is an axe you grab in an emergency to break down a door. Hope is a tool. Hope is a choice. Hope is something you say, I will not give in to death, darkness, despair. And I've been heavily, humans have faced really tough times like this. So many times. Droughts, famines, wars. It's only in the ultra-privileged West where we thought we got rid of suffering and death, that we thought, it's never going to be tough. This is what being alive is about.
Absolutely.
This is what being alive is about. And I think, then when Mandela moves to possibility, and not just an abstract, nice position paper, here's a theory of change, but he moves to, he moves to love.
He was truly remarkable.
Yeah. And I've also been reading a lot of the writings of Martin Luther King, and I'm still just a tiny beginner student in both cases.
Yeah.
But the ability of these two men facing an impossible situation rooted in hundreds of years of history and choosing to love and choosing to hope. I mean, is that what we need to do now or what? I mean, this is the only answer.
I think
And,
it is.
I have many young activist friends, and they're amazing, amazing. But in activism, it's easy to get stuck in anger and rage, which I get completely. I get it completely. But somehow we have to not just understand the possibility of change, and that there's quite good news. I mean, I can be really coherent on, yes, there's all these things we can do, and we would build a much better society in many levels. And there's lots of people doing work in that area. So the possibility, but we have to do it with hope and with love. And this is the other thing. And you knew Mr. Mandela. I never had the privilege, but here's my guess. He didn't think it was him. He thought he was a catalyst. Yes. I don't know what kind of language he maybe used about it, but when I've met a few leaders like this, not of his stature, but like local leaders, they talk about it flows through them. It's not like me, I personally saved this. It was all of us. I enabled, I guided, I was part. It's all about the community.
It is.
And part of the problem in the West is we've come to, the lone CEO who builds the firm, or the lone leader who makes the difference. Any real lone leaders, are like, no, it's the team. It was a bunch of us. And if I was helpful, that was not my doing. That was something larger than myself.
Well, one of our famous, sayings in Africa is, it takes a village. It's the collective. And
that's
we
all
grow
I'm saying.
up understanding that it takes a village. You know? And so it's inculcated in a culture and in a social structure. And all those early founders of the African National Congress grew up in that African spirit of Ubuntu, which is our human interconnectedness. And so there is a cultural change, a value shift, and that was very much part of the social cultural structure that supported that view of the world.
And we need that in the West.
Yeah.
I mean, we need it so much. I mean, as you know, that's where my current work and teaching is going. But that sense that, no, it's not just you, it's all of us that will solve this problem. Because if you think it's just you, I mean, rationally, there's nothing you can do.
Doesn't work.
So, I think we're so fortunate to have examples of people who have led these kinds of changes before, and can inspire the rest of us.
Absolutely. I'm going to shift gears a little, because I would love you to just briefly cover your 5-point plan, your own roadmap for change when it comes to corporation. Sure. I know there's 5 connected elements, and and if you could just briefly talk about creating shared value, building a purpose-driven organization, rewiring finance, building cooperation, and then fixing our institutions and government. And I know we don't have too much time, but perhaps if you could just give us a brief synopsis of each of those.
I'll give you the sort of very brief version. So step 1 is building a purpose-driven organization that is explicitly embracing the idea that your purpose is to contribute to the thriving of the society in which you find yourself engaged. And in all your decisions to strive to increase not only the well-being of the organization, which is important, and the well-being of the people who work within it, which is also important, but the broader world. So we could call this a stakeholder model, but a much more holistic model. And then the second step is realizing you can make money if you do that. So this is creating shared value. That is, you're creating value for the society and for the firm. And most firms are doing this right now. They just don't know it. So if you produce a product that people want, and pay your people decently and create good jobs, you're creating shared value. You're making a big difference in your community right now. And all we're talking about, in a sense, is, well, can you do more? Can you push harder? Can you treat your employees with more dignity and respect and pay them a decent wage? The answer is often yes, particularly if you're purpose-driven, because you increase productivity and creativity and innovation. We have lots of data on that. And perhaps you'll be able to identify new markets for addressing the huge problems that are emerging at the moment. And that will create shared value. You will be a new firm into plant-based foods, or circular construction, or textiles that are produced without generating enormous amounts of waste and water, and using tons of water and treating people like dirt. You know, maybe you can build a business model around that. And I go through the 5 or 6 business models and talk about lots of examples, all the way from Walmart to Quick Start, which is or Quick Save, which is a small convenience store chain.
Yeah.
I mean, there are all kinds of ways to really make a difference in the world and make money. And then I say, well, that's not going to be enough, right? It only gets us a bit of the way, because there are some things you want to do that are too expensive and will hurt, will be too much. And so then the next step is thinking cooperatively and working together. And a great example right now is the cement industry, which understands cement is responsible for about 10% of global emissions on the planet. And that's huge. And they know they have to bring down their emissions, but no single firm can change the production process. So they formed a consortium and they're working together to try and reduce emissions. They're sharing the cost in the interests of the whole industry. And cooperation is very, very powerful, but it's hard to sustain, because it's always easier not to do the right thing. And so sometimes you're tempted, well, yeah, I should be part of the consortium, but I don't really want to. So then we start talking about changes in finance and accounting, which is a huge subject in itself, but very quickly, you need to be able to hold firms to account. How do you know a firm is purpose-driven? How do you know a firm is part of a consortium and doing its job? You have to be able to measure and audit what they're actually doing. And that's where so-called environmental, social, and governance metrics come from. They're super important. They're still very much in the early stages, lots of work to be done, but they're going to be critical. And that, last but not least, we want capital, finance, to enforce firms doing things. We want finance to have a purpose.
Yeah.
And so that's the first 3 stages. And then the 4th stage is, purpose, shared value, cooperate. Fourth stage is, oh dear, we're going to need government. Because ultimately, business can't do this on its own. The state will have to regulate. We will need governments to say, I'm sorry, if you continue to use fossil fuels, that will be much more expensive, or that will be illegal. And so I suggest that firms that are really purpose-driven will advocate for strong democratic governance, strong governments with which they can partner to build a world in which capital and government are genuine partners in building the world we need. And last but not, and that's it. I did 5.
Yeah, you did 5. You did 5.
I did 5. And so the last is, and we need to fix the institutions. So purpose, shared value, cooperation, finance, government. 5, right?
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And the institutions, Rebecca, just briefly, I mean, which are the major institutions that you think are being, desecrated and need to be fixed?
Well, the most obvious is national governments. So I argue quite strongly in the book and in other work elsewhere that firms have a very strong interest in maintaining thriving democracies, that autocracies have a very bad track record, both in supporting economic growth, but also in supporting individual freedom and innovation and openness. And that we can't solve the kinds of problems we face unless we have that kind of democratic, flexible system. But I also argue that local and state governments are very important, and that the institutions of civil society, having a free and open media, having strong labor organizations that can give a voice to ordinary people, those kinds of institutions, strong educational institutions that are really tackling the problems we face, those are also important. So I use institutions in a very broad sense.
Yeah.
One of the problems with neoliberalism was it downplayed the importance of institutions. It said all we need are firms on their own and the free market. And, you know, any real country where the government is very weak, that's a failed state. And we know what those look like.
Yeah.
They do not look pretty.
No, thank you for that. Just a couple of fun facts. What is the what is one of the happiest memories of your childhood?
Crawling on my hands and knees through long grass when I was 4 or 5. I remember the grass was way, way higher than I was.
Yeah.
And I was playing Jungle Book with my father. And he was coming after me. He was a lion or a tiger. And I was Mowgli trying to get away through this jungle of grass.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember the smell of the grass. I remember my father. I remember that afternoon, sort of all bathed in a golden light.
That's wonderful. And what has been one of your most inspiring moments at Harvard Business School?
I don't want to pick any one of these,
Mm-hmm.
but the moments when a student will look at me in class or in office hours and say, "You've helped me see the world in a different way.
Yeah.
I'm going to do something different." I mean, there's no greater compliment you can pay a teacher.
Yeah.
And, you know, I get emails. I took your class 8 years ago, and now I'm doing this. And I would not have done it if I hadn't taken your class.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a gift.
Yeah.
Those moments are really great, great gifts.
That's wonderful. And something that very few people know about you. What is one thing that people seldom know about you?
I play the cello very badly,
Really?
but with great enthusiasm.
Really? I did not
I'm
know.
a passionate amateur cellist. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful, Rebecca. Well, in our final few moments, any final thoughts around the future of leadership and what it takes to lead boldly into the future?
I think the future of leadership is about 3 things. Doing your regular job really well.
Yeah.
Learning to see the bigger picture, to step up out of, I'm just the CEO, I'm just the dean, I'm just the divisional president, I'm just the sales manager. Learning to go up and understand that bigger world of which you're a part, and how what you could do alone or in partnership with others can make a difference in that bigger world. So your job is not just to look down, your job is to look out.
Yes.
And lastly, your job is to look inside. Because I think we are entering or are in a place which will be increasingly frightening, unpredictable, and difficult.
Yeah.
And humans that are afraid or under pressure don't perform well.
Yes.
And I think increasingly your job as a leader will be to be the person on the lifeboat as the leak starts to spring, to keep your head, to be in that position of quiet, deeply in touch with who you are and what your deepest values are and what you're about, to hold the shelter for everyone else.
That's very
powerful.
That's very powerful.
That's how I think about leadership.
And the last question, do you think Mandela's leadership is relevant for the world today? And if so, what do you think he would say our generation and the next?
Well, you know that I think it's relevant to the world today. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And what do I think he would say? I feel a bit shy answering because like he's one of the greats. So I'm sure whatever he would say would be better than whatever I will stammer out. But I think he might say something along the lines of, do not be afraid.
Yeah.
Remember, we're in this together. You act not because you're sure it's going to work, but because you must. Because that is the thing we do. We act from love to protect our children. That's what we do.
Yes, yes. Rebecca, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your incredible insights, your humanity, your authenticity, and your incredible knowledge and skill. And it's such a joy and a pleasure to have you as part of this movement.
And thank you so much. Thank you for all the incredible work that you are doing, your persistence and your passion, and for, I think, bringing to the world something that's incredibly important. You know, we know that humans have many sources of awe, that sense when you're in touch with something greater than yourself. But the number one is extraordinary moral beings. And Nelson Mandela was one of those. And you're reminding us of his legacy, of his importance, of who he was right now, feels to me a really important thing to do.
Thank you. Listening to my outstanding professor from Harvard Business School, Professor Rebecca Henderson, a woman I admire and applaud, is a bit like being back in class at HBS. Rebecca provokes and evokes critical new thinking around our old worldview of capitalism and corporations, their purpose, societal role, and relation to the state. Her theory of change is a systemic framework and a practical pathway for big business to leverage the power of the purse to tackle these big challenges in the world and to create a new brand of capitalism that is profitable, equitable, and sustainable. Climate change is a wicked problem. Denial is pervasive. Change is hard, messy, and slow. Whilst this is an unprecedented challenge, super-performing and bold corporations worldwide are pioneering the way. Companies are tackling these big business, environmental, and social issues, and at the same time, they are increasing consumer demand, reducing business risk, and cutting costs. Examples include the Dutch and British-owned consumer goods multinational giant Unilever, who in 2010 announced the Sustainable Living Plan. Another example is the American publicly traded and family-owned retail giant Walmart, who responded boldly to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Shortly after that, they committed to audacious goals around renewable energy and energy-saving plans. By 2017, Walmart had doubled their transport efficiency, which saved the corporation $1 billion US, around 4% of net income. So let's revisit Rebecca's 5-point systemic plan for change. What are these bold and leading corporations and corporate chiefs doing to innovate, adapt, and transform? Firstly, they are creating shared value for the business and society. They are turning social problems into business opportunities. Secondly, they are revolutionizing purpose within the firm, where every and all decisions impact not only the company positively, but employees, partners, business partners, the community, and the outer world. Thirdly, they are building collaborations with competitors within their industry to tackle big industry issues and to share massive costs. The fourth part of the plan is that collectively we need to rewire finance to do impact investing in firms that are profitable, equitable, and sustainable, and hold those firms accountable. And the fifth part of the plan is collectively we need to rebuild our institutions. For example, strengthen our democracies, ensure that our governments are trusted and functional and are able to legislate and regulate industries and corporations. Self-regulation does not work. Business, big business, can do well and do good. Reimagining capitalism makes societal and good business sense. Friends, in the end, we do not want to look our children and grandchildren in the eye and answer to the fact that the planet got destroyed. But for one beautiful moment, we created a huge amount of shareholder value. Leveraging big business to protect our planet and save our world is the right thing to do. Additionally, the business case and Mandela's leadership blueprint as a new paradigm for corporate chiefs to think, act, and lead like Mandela today makes this both hopeful and possible. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time, one small step for you, but together with big business, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.